I have a new thing, a new Fitbit, and it's giving the wrong time all the time. I thought I had it fixed this morning, but evidently not. Okay. We are going to start today on page 141, Swami Prakashananda. And Swami Prakashananda was in St. Louis for years. So we'll start down there. It was in February 1910, as far as I remember, that I saw Maharaj for the first time. Having been associated with the ideals and activities of the Ramakrishna Order from my boyhood, I had long cherished a desire to visit at the earliest opportunity Dakshineshwar, Bellarmont, and such personalities as the Holy Mother, Maharaj, and M., the recorder of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. With this object in view, I came to Calcutta from my hometown. I had already visited the Holy Mother and M. a day or two before. It was on the day of the Saraswati Puja, the worship of the goddess of knowledge, that I crossed the Ganges and went to Bellarmont in a ferry boat. As I walked along the grassy lawn toward the old residential building of the monastery, I noticed that Maharaj was seated on the open terrace facing the gate. Thus, he was the first person I saw on my first visit to the monastery. I would have considered it a coincidence had I not been told in later years that Swami Prabhavananda and Swami Akhilananda had similar experiences. I bowed to Maharaj and took the dust of his feet. He very affectionately asked me in a sweet voice where I had come from and where I lived. I told him I lived very close to the house where Swami Vivekananda had stayed when he visited our hometown. The second time I saw Maharaj was in December 1911. Although I had been closely associated with the Ramakrishna Order and had great admiration for the monastic life, I did not yet know if I could ever be a monk. Each time I came to Maharaj, he made some remark which confirmed my belief that he already knew the future course of my life. He told me, "You should come here as often as you can. You will not be the loser." For several years, I could not see Maharaj because whenever I came to Bellarmont, he was away. Meanwhile, I became well acquainted with Swami Brahmananda. One day at Dhaka, Swami Brahmananda introduced me to Maharaj, saying, "This boy has been trying to secure a plot of land for our order." Maharaj remarked, "I know him." Swami Brahmananda said, "How? You were not at the monastery when he came." Then I said, "I met Maharaj some years ago." Maharaj turned to me and asked, "Can you find a place for us?" I did not understand what he meant. He repeated the question. I told him, "It is all for you, Maharaj." He simply smiled. I did not know then that he was asking me whether I had a place for him in my heart. This is one example of how even in ordinary conversation, his words had much deeper significance than we realized at the time. On one occasion, Maharaj said, "Continue your spiritual practice in the way you are doing." From my early youth, I used to sit regularly every day for meditation. I did not know whether I was gaining anything from it or whether I was proceeding correctly. I had not told Maharaj anything about it. Therefore, his remark made a tremendous impression on me. How had he known? I had not even asked him for spiritual instruction. Several times he told me, "Do not be impatient." I wondered what he meant because it did not seem to me that I was. Later, when I asked him for spiritual advice, he gave me preliminary instructions saying, "You will have a new life." Actually, I felt that a light was kindled within me which has burned ever since. Gradually, it seemed that the spiritual treasure house was unlocked and the entire spiritual realm became an open book. It was not until 1916 that I made the decision to enter the monastic life. I asked Maharaj for approval. He said, "As long as your mother is alive, you should not leave her. She has no one else to look after her. You should serve her. Just practice truthfulness and continence." He did not prescribe any further rules or regulations for me. When Maharaj initiated me, I asked him, "What relationship shall I maintain with my chosen ideal?" He said, "This will develop within you as you follow the spiritual course. He is your all in all." Then I asked him the meaning of the mantram. He said, "There is no difference in meaning between the mantram and the chosen ideal. They mean the same thing. He is your all in all." The one thing that Maharaj urged was the steady and persistent practice of the instruction he gave. Twice he prescribed for me Purishcharnan. That's a ritualistic prescribed repetition of the mantra in a pattern. Maharaj hardly spoke about himself or Ramakrishna. One day at Balaram Bose's house, a lay devotee, Lalit Babu, pointed to a wall painting of Sri Ramakrishna and asked Maharaj, "Was the master like this?" Maharaj looked at the picture and became very grave, as if his thoughts were too deep for words. Holy places had a special attraction for Maharaj. I spent memorable days with him in the Advaita ashram in Benares. Maharaj seemed to be in the happiest mood there. From time to time, he spoke highly of the spiritual atmosphere of the place. There were continuous festivity, worship, and devotional singing and dancing. Every morning we used to assemble in Maharaj's room for meditation. In the evenings, all the Swamis met there and asked questions. Maharaj would answer them. There were lively discussions. One day I was late in arriving. The whole room was full. I tried to secure a seat among the Swamis. As I turned from one to another, Maharaj jokingly remarked, "First trace, then you can write. You have to go through preliminary exercises to enter the fold." All laughed. One day in Benares, I asked Maharaj, "I do not feel any love for God, nor do I feel any attachment to the world. Does this mean that I have bad tendencies within me?" Maharaj said, "You don't have to worry about that." Maharaj always treated me very affectionately. Once, Lalit Babu wanted me to collect funds for the temple at the Holy Mother's birthplace, but Maharaj did not approve of it. He thought it would be too hard a task for me. It was not often that I brought any present to Maharaj, but whenever I took any offering to him, he accepted it very graciously with deep appreciation. Even when I made blunders, he was unperturbed. On one occasion, I made a bad mistake, which would have offended any other spiritual teacher, but Maharaj was exceedingly gracious. In Maharaj, I found for the first time a person who could love others, not in spite of, but with all their faults. His love drew me, and I could not get away. He could hardly brook any criticism of his disciples by others. One day I came to see Maharaj at Balaram Bose's house and found him seated in the living room after the noontime siesta. Just then Golap Ma, a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, and and companion of the Holy Mother, came to the room. She was relating how a lay devotee had held a special worship in his home, to which he had invited some of the Swamis and had given presents to them. Then she remarked, "Although he is serving the Swamis with great devotion, his character is not changing." Maharaj became very grave and said, "Golapma, you don't understand." Sometimes Maharaj made fun at the expense of Swami Akhandananda and other brother disciples and asked me to assist him. But his eyes and face always bore an expression of inner serenity and profundity. His brother disciples held Maharaj in great reverence. One day, Swami Sardananda came to Maharaj's room at the Udbodhan office to report on Swami Turiyananda, who was ill at the time and staying upstairs. Swami Sardananda was standing beside the cot on which Maharaj was seated. Maharaj asked him to sit by him, but Swami Sardananda kept standing. When Maharaj repeated the request, Swami Sardananda, as if in obedience to his wish, picked up the corner of the mattress and sat on the bare cot. He did not think himself worthy of sitting on the same mattress as Maharaj. One day, Swami Dhirananda told Maharaj about me. "He has some questions, Maharaj." Maharaj turned to me and said, "You have seen a holy man. You have bowed to him. You have touched his feet. What more questions can there be?" I used to read the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads before I came to Maharaj, but it was only after I received his grace that I could absorb the true spirit of the scriptures. Though I studied hard before, I had not understood the real significance of the words. But later, everything became clear to me, and I felt that it was all through the grace of Maharaj. He did not talk much on religion, but transmitted spirituality in silence. He was the very embodiment of love and compassion. His unconditional grace is my only resource. This Swami Sat Prakashananda had the reputation of being one of the most scholarly Swamis in the order. And he said he had never understood the scripture until Maharaj blessed him. Our next Swami is Swami Omkareshwarananda. It was the evening of March 14th, 1916, the day following the public celebration of Sri Ramakrishna's birthday. Swami Brahmananda and Swami Akhandananda were seated on a bench on the eastern veranda of the Belar Monastery, overlooking the Ganges. Several other Swamis and young brahmacharis were seated on a bench nearby. Presently, Swami Achalananda, who was one of the group, addressed Swami Brahmananda. "Revered sir, please tell us something about Sri Ramakrishna. To hear of him directly from you is far more inspiring and uplifting than to read of him and his teachings in the gospel." "Very little of the Master's teachings is recorded in the gospel," replied the Swami. "There's too much repetition. M used to visit the Master occasionally and would note down his teachings as he heard them. But Sri Ramakrishna taught his disciples differently according to their different temperaments and their capacity of understanding. His teachings to the monastic disciples were given in private. As soon as householder disciples would leave the room, he would get up and lock the door and then speak to us living words of renunciation. He would try to impress upon our young minds the emptiness and vanity of worldly enjoyments. In his great mercy, he would point out to us how dry and hot the world is, like a desert, and how, like a mirage, it burns the heart but never slakes the thirst. He taught us how to discriminate and analyze the body of man, made up as it is of flesh, blood, and bones, etc., so that our minds would not run after the enjoyments of the flesh. He would tell us of the great power of the all-bewitching Maya, and how man, forgetting his divine heritage, falls ever and again into her clutches. Deep down within his heart, man knows full well that there is no lasting happiness to be found in the mad pursuit of worldly enjoyment. And yet, like the camel who chews thorny bushes even while his mouth bleeds, so man stirs up his lust for enjoyment even while he suffers. To satisfy his lust, man needs gold, lust and gold. These are the chains that drag a man down to the pit of worldliness. He alone soars high who shakes himself free of these chains. He who renounces sexual appetites, not in conduct only, but also in thought, it is he who has renounced all worldly pleasures. He alone is a man of true renunciation. Renunciation is not in the garb of a monk, nor is it in the renunciation of fish and meat. Spiritual aspirants of many different sects would come to visit Sri Ramakrishna at Dakshineshwar, and all of them found great satisfaction in talking to him. To each, he was able to show the way to further progress along his own particular path, so that each thought that the master was a perfected soul of his own particular sect. They could not know that Sri Ramakrishna was as broad as the sky and as deep as the ocean, and thoroughly acquainted with all the different sects and paths. For he had followed them each in turn, and by each path he had reached the same goal. Never forget that the ideal of life is to realize God, to see God. You have renounced the world to reach that goal. Struggle hard to grow in love for him. Attain him. He is the very life of our life, the soul of our soul. He is the Lord of our heart. He is our very own. Yearn for him with a longing heart. How blessed you are that you have the privilege of serving and associating with such ever-free souls as Swami Brahmananda and others who are the associates of God incarnate. Do not neglect this opportunity. You are men. Be gods. Teach others by the example of your own lives. Swami Brahmananda remained silent for a while, then continued. I see very clearly that after we are gone, multitudes will come to learn from you young men. A young Swami. But revered sir, how can that be? If multitudes are to come, they should come while you are still living. Swami Brahmananda replied, do not think that you are any less great than we. You have received the grace of the Holy Mother. Do you think we have become great just because we people have come to take the dust of our feet? No. We first saw Sri Ramakrishna and then renounced the world. You are great indeed, because you have renounced the world without seeing him. Young Swami, but revered sir, Sri Ramakrishna made you great. Swami Brahmananda, no, Sri Ramakrishna did not make us great. He made us nobodies. You also have to become nobodies. Wipe out all vanity and all sense of ego. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, when the ego dies, all troubles cease. Not I, but thou, O Lord. Look at the life of Nag Mahashai. There was not the least trace of ego in him. G.C. Ghosh used to say, Maya tried hard to bind Nag Mahashai and Vivekananda in her net. But Nag Mahashai became smaller than the smallest so that the net could not hold him, and Vivekananda grew bigger and bigger. He became one with the infinite, and the net was too small to bind him. Do you know of what this net of Maya is comprised? Sense objects, lust, gold, name, fame, ego, vanity, selfishness, and so on. With all these, Maya binds the mind of man. Come out of this net, and the mind will run straight to God. All bondage is in the mind. All freedom is in the mind. The worldly man is drunk with the objects of sense, with name, with fame, with lust, with gold. Be you also drunk, but be drunk with selfless works, with love of God, with ecstasy, with samadhi. Swami Brahmananda now came and sat silently beside Swami Brahmananda. Swami Shivananda followed and sat on a bench facing them. Many young swamis and brahmacharis, about 60 altogether, came and sat around the swamis. In the presence of Swami Brahmananda, the spiritual son and most beloved disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, the minds of all were filled with joy. They became lost in contemplation. Stillness reigned within their hearts. All nature seemed to stand still while the Ganges flowed silently by. Some time passed in that great silence, until after a while it was broken by a remark about the well-known Shankara monastery at Puri and the abbots connected with it. Then, as the conversation drifted from one subject to another, Swami Brahmananda said, "Once, when I was at Puri, I met a holy man whose name was Rangaswami. He was about 95 years old and a man of great renunciation. He was always drunk with the love of God. He would eat only that which had first been offered in the temple. At one time he was very ill and I wanted to give him some medicine, but he refused to take it. Knowing his habit, I arranged with the priest of the temple to offer some milk to the deity, and with that I mixed the medicine, which the Swami took as sacramental food. In the course of conversation, a well-known writer and preacher was mentioned. Swami Shivananda, but what can he know about religion? He is steeped in worldliness. He who does not live the life of renunciation cannot be a teacher. Dispassion is the first principle of spiritual life. A man of learning may write books or give lectures, but if he has no dispassion in his heart, and if he does not practice what he teaches, his words cannot be effective, for they have no power behind them. They merely create a momentary sensation." The other day I learned that a certain teacher of the Brahmo Samaj was complaining about that more people were coming to the Belar Mat and fewer to the Brahmo Samaj, and that someone had suggested that they introduce a girls' choir to attract the people. When the revered Shivanath Shastri heard this, he remarked that if the Brahmos would incorporate into their lives more of the dispassion and renunciation of the monks of Belar Mat, they too would attract people. Swami Brahmananda, Shivanath Shastri is a sincere soul and has a great regard for truth. He is earnest in his desire to realize God. He is living now at Bhubaneswar and is practicing spiritual disciplines. He already has some inner awakening. After all, he had the blessed good fortune to associate with our master. Bijoy Goswami was another great spiritual leader in the Brahmo Samaj, and it was a great loss to the Samaj when he left it. Swami Shivananda, one day Swamiji, Swami Akhandananda, and I were traveling on the river Ganges. Swamiji was speaking very highly of Devendranath Tagore, when all at once we noticed the Maharshi's yacht at some distance from us. We approached nearer to pay our respects to the Maharshi, who, when he learned that we were disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, seemed very happy to meet with us and repeatedly remarked, "Ah, how great is the love of Sri Ramakrishna! How great is his devotion!" The Maharshi then asked Swamiji to recite some passages from the Upanishads, which he did. After listening for some time, he said, "I understand and appreciate the devotional passages of the Upanishads. I do not care for the non-dualistic ideas." After listening to the discussions for some time, Swami Brahmananda remarked, "When Shivanath Shastri and some other of the learned members of the Brahmo Samaj would visit Sri Ramakrishna, he would sometimes become just like a child and ask them, 'Is my condition really like that of one who is mad? Tell me, have I gone crazy thinking of God?' And indeed, there were some who really did think that our master was a madman." Swami Brahmananda, "Only a jeweler can know the value of a jewel. There was once a poor man who found a diamond. He had no idea of its value. So he took it to the vegetable market to have it appraised. The vegetable man looked at it and offered him 5 cents worth of vegetables for it. But the poor man thought it was worth 20 cents. Upon being refused, he took it to a rice merchant who offered him 1 bag of rice, but he wanted 4 bags. Next, he went to the goldsmith, and he was offered 100 rupees. This offer aroused the greed in the man, and he began to realize that the diamond was really valuable. So he took it to a jeweler who offered him 20,000 rupees. Even this did not satisfy him. So he took it to the finest jeweler in the city. As soon as the jeweler saw it, he realized its real worth and immediately offered him 1,000,000 rupees. And that is how it goes. A holy man is judged according to the worth and capacity of the appraiser. By some, Sri Ramakrishna was regarded as a holy man, by others as a madman. But those who knew saw in him the manifest incarnation of God. Now, are there any questions? I think we're going to stop there. Our next week we'll do Tara, who was one of the women who came to visit Sri Ramakrishna. Any questions or comments from anyone? I never had any either when I read that. It seems very simple and plain, and the message is very clear. Okay, so we'll have the Gospel reading of Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna on Saturday at 5 o'clock. Remember, the temple is open now for Vespers every evening. And next Sunday will be Swami Satyamayananda speaking on the nature of samsara at 11 o'clock here in the temple, also on Zoom and YouTube. But we had a nice turnout last Sunday with Swami Mahayogananda, and it was really nice to have people back in the temple. Hope to see you. If there's no comments or questions, we'll end with a chant. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.